Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for the latest in the Miller Knoll Insight series. I'm Mark Catchlove and I lead the Miller Knoll Insight and Strategy Group globally. We are a company that manufactures products for the home, for where people work, where they learn and where they get healed. And we love to hear insights from different people and different organizations. And I'm really pleased today to introduce you to Lee Elliott, who is Global Head of Occupier Research at Knight Frank. And he's going to be sharing a talk entitled Your Space, Identifying the Challenges Shaping Corporate Real Estate. Lee, I'll let you tell us a little bit about Knight Frank and what you do. And please feel free to use the chat box for questions, which I'll put to Lee at the end. Lee, over to you.
Mark, thanks very much. And what a wonderful surprise this early in the morning to see that we have people coming in from all over the world, in all different time zones. As Mark said, we have a shared heritage, as it were, both academically, but also in the context of working in the real estate space. By way of introduction, I've been in the industry for 25 years. Yes, I started very young. And the first 15 of those years was with JLL, and then the last 10 has been with Knight Frank, where, as Mark said, I lead our occupier research platform. What that essentially is doing is talking on a daily basis to occupiers of real estate, principally office users, but not exclusively so, and understanding how their use of space, their attitudes to space, where office space is on the corporate agenda, all of that is explored and played back to the market as a whole, both to other occupiers to give a sense of where people are on their respective journeys relative to their peer group or indeed their competitors. And then a really important part of my job, which perhaps often gets overlooked, is to effectively create a voice of customer that gets played back into the supply side of the industry. Landlords, investors and the like, to ensure that we close what has been a pretty big gap between what customers want and what they've typically got. The more that we can do to provide insights from the end user, the more chance we have of having product in the market that is good for everyone. So that's a little bit of a crusade of mine as well. I've got a PhD from Loughborough University. I didn't do that for particularly honourable reasons. It was all about trying to extend my running career, which failed miserably. But I did come out with a PhD, and I've been constantly interested in issues of economic development, which property is a key part of, with a real fascination on business users of space and how that has changed. The product I'm going to share with you today, and this is not a death by PowerPoint experience, it's about a 25, 30 slide deck, is the latest iteration of our Your Space research, which we launched back in May of this year. I'll tell you a little bit about the credentials of that research in a second, but really important to note that this is the fourth iteration of Your Space, a journey that we started back in 2018. I didn't feel it at the time, but in 2018 it was a pretty easy piece of research to write because there was a pretty singular direction for most occupiers in the context of their use of office space. It was about rationalization, optimization. It was about 5-day-a-week office working. It was about trying to make the office more meaningful and more purposeful. And then, while I was rolling that out, we got into the COVID period of 2020, which meant that we had to bring forward our second edition, which I delivered wholly in 2 dimensions in webinars across the world. Got through that, tried to diffuse some of the nonsense around the death of the office, which, having said I've been 25 years in the industry, I'm probably on my 5th iteration of the death of the office. It still hasn't died, and nor will it going forward. And then we did a 3rd edition in 2023. So this is the very latest edition, the 4th edition of the research, What we effectively do is a survey-based methodology. The survey is about a 30-minute ask of corporate real estate leaders around the world. This time round, we got 292, to be precise, respondents representing 268 companies from around the world. 80% of the respondents operate multi-market, so effectively they aren't, they're working across border and having to deal with what I think is a growing cultural nuance around space and work style, which I'll come on to. People generally ask me, well, 292, is that a robust sample? Well, in the context of the corporate real estate profession, it's a pretty sizable sample of that industry. But if I assure you further by saying that those 292 respondents directly manage 650 million square foot of real estate across the world. So in essence, the group thought that comes through this presentation is a signal of how the market is thinking about space. Now, having said all of that, one thing that's very clear from the post-pandemic period is there is more variance in occupier behaviour than we've ever seen before. Different behaviours, different attitudes, different nuances. So as we walk through this presentation and as I share insights from the tour that we've been doing around it, please bear in mind that I'm giving you a pretty general view, and there will be extremes around that view, both geographically, sectorally, or from company to company. Okay, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour of what's to come. This is what I want to cover, and this is effectively the structure of the Your Space survey laid out before you. We had an interesting methodology which enabled us to really get into some of the nitty-gritty topics that surveys don't typically allow you to get into. So first of all, on the sort of left-hand side of the chart, as you look, the bold line, as you look, everybody that we surveyed asked some questions specifically around the sort of macro influences on corporate real estate strategy. These are really important points in shaping the thinking at a high level around attitudes towards real estate and space. So everybody answered those, and I want to just start my presentation by giving that context. And thereafter, we asked a range of questions in what I call these three challenge areas that are presented to the right-hand side of the line. This edition of Your Space was all about trying to understand where our clients, where occupiers are most challenged in the real estate sphere. And we wanted to do that in three particular ways. One, how does real estate support business growth and transformation? And what are the implications of that relationship? Two, at a regional or global level, what's occurring from a portfolio management standpoint? Are we seeing an extension of portfolios? Are we seeing a retraction? And why? And then the third area, which will be most germane to a lot of you, I think, in terms of this series, is the conversation that's been ongoing since the pandemic around how the workplace is evolving. Effectively, what does the office of the future look like? And I'll probably put a little bit more emphasis on that final point and that final section as we go through the presentation, but would argue that all of them are sort of are significant and worthy of a little bit of attention. So that's my agenda. Let's get straight into it by looking at what's shaping corporate real estate strategy. Now, it's really important as a timestamp on this research. I mentioned that we published this research in May of this year, but the survey was undertaken between sort of March and mid-April. And one of the things to note as I go through this presentation is that about 85% of all respondents had submitted their surveys prior to the so-called Liberation Day in early April, when the global trade rules were ripped up effectively. So it's really important to note that, because where I talk about the geographical dispersal of occupiers and their real estate portfolios, we're probably underplaying that because of the way that the global economy is likely to reshape on the back of tariffs and trade wars that have clearly been escalated by the Trump administration. So with that in mind, what's shaping strategy? Well, there's a lot of interesting things here. This is probably half my presentation in itself, which I'll avoid, but let me sort of put a fly on the water through this particular slide. The back end of 2024, I wrote a paper that was essentially a thought piece. It wasn't data driven at all, but we identified as a house 10 issues that we felt were going to sort of dominate the mindset of the occupier, the corporate real estate leader, as we went through 2025. And those 10 issues are seen across the bottom of this graph. And then when I thought, well, actually, we're going out to the market and surveying corporate real estate leaders, why don't we ask them which of these 10 issues that I think will be important really are important? Everybody was able to identify up to 3 of the 10 as being significant in shaping their corporate real estate strategy. And what this slide shows you is the aggregate position. So, yeah, we think the data shows there are 4 issues that dominate the thinking of more than a quarter of all respondents, and therefore, one would argue, are foremost in shaping corporate real estate strategy. Just to deal with those very quickly, the first of those is this is corporate real estate 101, right? That, you know, in the 25 years that I've been in the industry, every corporate real estate leader I've ever dealt with has had to sort of walk this tightrope between supporting the business growth and innovation or transformation and managing cost. We know that real estate is the second largest cost of most businesses, somewhere in the region of 7 to 12% of operating costs. And as a result, when economic environments get a little bit tougher, and we are in a low growth for longer economic environment in the main globally, then this balancing act between growth and cost control becomes paramount. And that is very much the case in our latest findings, with effectively 2/3 of all respondents citing that as an influence. That is linked to issues 2 and 4 on this slide, which is, you know, a growing uncertainty and volatility in the operating environment. I'll illustrate that graphically a little bit later, but there's no doubt that occupiers have been challenged in making decisions, whether it's to refit their space, whether it's to take new space, whether it's to consolidate, because the needle's been moving, you know, in terms of the global economy, sentiment, business confidence. The willingness of businesses to expend capital has been highly variable over the last 18 months, and certainly since the advent of Liberation Day. And linked to that is our 4th item here, which affects more than 26% of respondents, which is sort of ongoing trade wars and political tensions, and that redrawing of geopolitics and geoeconomics, which has a real implication on what the corporate map of the future might look like. You'll notice I skipped over the 3rd one. It's important for this conversation, which is we are still fascinated, and possibly rightly so, around changes to work style and what that means for workplace. If I asked this question back in our 2020 survey, this would have been far and away the number 1 issue. I do sense from talking to corporate real estate leaders every day. I've just come back from Hong Kong, where I spoke to probably some in the region of 200 leaders over the course of a week. You know, very few are actually now talking about the old favourites of return to office and occupancy rates and what's your number. You know, most people are focused on recognising that there is a different work style in play, that our work style of the future will be more flexible than it was in the past, and as a result, our relationship with the office will be more flexible and fluid than ever before. That has implications for how much space, what type of spaces I'll come on to, but it's perhaps not as foremost in corporate real estate leaders' minds as it once was. One slightly defensive point that I want to make here, you'll notice that the 10th issue on this slide is ESG. And I don't want anybody to walk away from this presentation and say, well, look, you know, ESG doesn't matter to the occupier. Knight Frank have said so, Lee said so. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in a context of 10 issues, it is relatively low down the agenda. But also, I think this positioning of ESG is reflective of a maturation of the ESG discussion. 2 things to note here. One, politically, ESG has changed a little in terms of its positioning, particularly stateside, but not exclusively so. And then secondly, and more importantly, I think most occupiers have stopped looking for what I call the green bullet. So what we had in 2020 onwards was a lot of occupiers looking to advance ESG strategy and meet targets by sort of making smart real estate decisions. And they very quickly realized that real estate can only ever be part of the solution. And that actually just taking a certified building in a market is not enough. So what we are increasingly seeing is ESG being sort of built into every part of the property life cycle from an occupier standpoint. Yes, procurement of space, but also day-to-day operation, retrofit of space, etc., etc. So ESG, no longer a green bullet, still very important, but more tactical than perhaps strategic. I'll stop the defence there. Maybe that's one we can pick up in questions. But you get the sense of the shape. So, a little bit of back to basics around balancing this tightrope issue, dealing with the headwinds that we see macroeconomically, but also reacting to what has now become an established, I think, position around a more flexible form of work. If you simplify the question and ask real estate leaders, okay, over the next 5 years, as you formulate strategy, what's your primary goal? So rather than giving them a choice of influences, what are they trying to ultimately achieve? 4 in 10, just short of 4 in 10 of all real estate leaders are in a sort of 101 position, which is enhancing the efficiency of operations. So real estate as a factor of production, as something that supports businesses in doing what they do and making that as efficient as possible. However, there is an important additional word, which is a direct implication of the changing of those trade laws and rules, which is this building of resilience. So I think historically, and particularly as we went into the pandemic years, the corporate real estate playbook was very much about rationalization, maximizing utilization, getting top bang for buck out of the space that occupiers held, and making it as streamlined as possible. I think in this environment where trading rules are changing, almost on a weekly basis, there's an important emergence of resilience, which is about ensuring that you are still able to function either side of changing trade relationships. So it's a much more defensive play to ensure that you can continue operating rather than just operating efficiently. There are some smaller issues that work down the left-hand side of this chart, but on the right-hand side, the other big issues that tend to be dominating strategy, again, supporting workplace flexibility. And then positively for the market, the last two, about 13% of all respondents looking at scaling for market growth and geographically expanding as a reaction to that new operating environment. And then the final issue, which has dominated the airwaves in many regards, is occupiers really getting focused and stuck into right-sizing their portfolio. Please notice the language there. The language is right-sizing, not downsizing. When I talk to journalists with this research, they always want to talk about the downsizing of space. And clearly there are occupiers out there that have been doing that, have done that. But this is about space optimization rather than downright downsizing. So apologies in advance to anyone that's got a journalist as a family member, spouse, etc. I'm a little down on journalists and how they've dealt with occupancy issues over the last 6 years, as I'll probably allude to as we go through this presentation further. And then there's this sort of final sort of strategic element that I think is really often missed in the real estate discussion. So when I talk to leasing agents, and we have a lot of them as a real estate advisor, what you tend to hear from leasing agents is what we need for occupiers to be expansive and take more space is we need headcount growth or economic growth. Well, absolutely, we would love a bit more than that than we're probably getting at the moment. But actually, it's not the only thing that drives occupier decision making. Another thing that drives occupier decision making is business transformation, because often real estate is the embodiment of a change that goes on in the way that businesses do things or the structure that they adopt on the back of trying to do things differently. And what's interesting, as shown in this slide, is 70% of all of the respondents Your Space survey anticipate entering into one or more of what I call offensive transformation strategies before 2030, i.e. strategies that are likely to be accretive to space or to lead to additional dots on the geographical map over the next 5 years. So, these are strategies like entering into new markets, digitally transforming the business, which there's still quite a bit of work to do on, not least because of the advent of AI, diversification into new business areas, and growth via acquisition. So 70% focused on that more positive posture for the future. And, that's about double the rate that we saw back in 2023, the last time we did the survey, where about just over a third actually of all occupiers felt that they were going to dive into transformation strategy. So there's no doubt that we are seeing an impetus building within the occupier mindset about transformation, which I believe has a more positive implication for real estate than is probably been portrayed in the market. It's an equation. It's not an equation, but I was never good at maths. Same school as Mark. Disruption equals demand is the equation. I think we will see demand emerging in global real estate markets because of the disruption of businesses, not simply because they're growing or otherwise. I can see a note from Sylvia here. Really good point. I should have mentioned it at the start in terms of the geographical origin of respondents. Let me just address that very quickly. So just to restate a point, 80% of all respondents were multi-market. So they're not tied to one geography. They're either tied to a region or have a global remit and therefore work across border. But that said, if you look at where the people that we surveyed are based, there's probably a slight bias towards APAC. Somewhere in the region of 50% of all respondents were APAC orientated in terms of at least where they reside and function, followed by Europe and then followed by corporate America. So if anything, corporate America's viewpoint here is a little bit downplayed in our survey findings. Hopefully, Sylvia, that's addressed the question. So there's the context. We've got occupiers really focused on the basics, the 101 play of optimization and efficiency and cost control and balance. But we've also got occupiers really thinking about transformation of their business and recognizing that is likely to have implications for their real estate use, both in quantum and quality terms going forward. So that's the macro piece. That's the sort of left-hand side of my opening chart, as it were. Let's get into these three challenge areas. And the first of those is the relationship between real estate and that sort of business growth transformation dynamic. But just before I get to the next slide, the methodology that we adopted in each of these three challenge areas was really quite simple. We asked all respondents in this area, where are you most challenged? Simple, as clear cut as that. When it comes to aligning to, or supporting business growth and transformation, there were two dominant issues that stood out in our responses. So about a third of all respondents believed it was about mitigating that uncertainty that is coming through the economic environment and the operational risk that's inherent in that. And then slightly more, and the dominant sort of response was all about how do we align. Our biggest challenge is aligning real estate strategy with business strategy. So the others are all important, not least the third issue there around market dynamics, because there's no doubt that markets are turning against the occupier increasingly, particularly at the quality end. But I don't have time to really cover that today. That might be another seminar in the future, Mark. But let's focus on those first two issues. I think they're really important in setting the tone of and understanding the occupier mindset. So the first thing to say is that this has been a sort of a central message of your space since we started the journey back in 2018. When you talk to corporate real estate leaders, and fully accepting survey bias here, occupiers, real estate leaders understand that real estate matters strategically. They recognize that real estate is more than a box that you put people in, that actually if you make the right real estate decisions, you can support wider strategy, you can confer competitive advantage on your business relative to your peer group, or you can ensure that some of the critical issues that are out there are mitigated. So we've heard consistently since 2018, despite all the headwinds that we've experienced as an industry, that 90% of all corporate real estate leaders regard real estate as a strategic device. What the chart is showing you, and clearly it's a little bit arbitrary because it's putting out issues that are actually quite interconnected. But in doing so, we've identified the sort of strategic issues running at the corporate level that real estate best supports. So again, similar message to before in terms of the top issue. It's all about efficiency and cost management, but there are also more positive roles for real estate to play, namely supporting brand and image. I was in Singapore about 2 months ago and had the first conversation I've had in probably 5 years about the importance of external signage on buildings and how that supports corporate brand and image. And then the third issue, which I think is, if I was asked, what's the one thing that you've seen in your career that's shifted most dramatically, it's certainly the recognition of the role of the workplace, principally the office, in supporting the well-being of its occupants. There is no doubt, particularly in the post-pandemic world, that the well-being of staff has become a corporate issue, both morally and in some cases regulatory. And as a result, real estate and the type of real estate that people are occupying is now starting to support that employee well-being agenda. There are lots of other agendas here, but those are the three sort of dominant ones. So we get this message that real estate matters. It's, creates advantage, it mitigates risk, it's strategic. However, when you ask people about, corporate real estate strategy and how aligned it is to the formation of business strategy, bear in mind that 70% of all businesses are likely to go through some sort of strategic transformation. There's a slightly different picture, which is that the people that are making the corporate real estate decision are often divorced or downstream from where business strategy is formulated. So what we get is a situation where effectively 3/4 of corporate real estate leaders are actually downstream from the decision making. They tend to be more responsive than actually inputting into strategy formulation. They don't tend to have the opportunity to flag issues around a strategy that might shape real estate. They're not able to influence in the extent to which they possibly could or should. This has been an ongoing debate at CoreNet. If anybody in the audience is familiar with CoreNet, the industry body for corporate real estate, every conference I've been to over the last 20 years, somewhere there's a conversation about when does corporate real estate get a seat at the boardroom table? Well, I'm not sure it's about having a seat at the boardroom table, because the corporate real estate decision or discussion is a much more elevated discussion now. C-suite players want to think about the real estate dimension, but there's no doubt there is a distance between business strategy formulation and real estate strategy. And in markets that are turning against occupiers, that is quite dangerous, because it will often lead to additional cost, compromise, and challenge, as shown by the next slide. So what a misalignment is effectively a missed opportunity. If we don't get that alignment strategically with where the business is going and the real estate dimension of that, you end up sort of having real difficulty in truly forecasting business needs, which means you either become long or short on space. And there's quite a lot of examples of organizations out there that are in that place right now. You don't tend to get the resource or the budgets that are required to drive change. You end up with this misalignment between the speed of change that's going on in the business versus the speed of change capable within real estate. I keep getting told that real estate is much more customer friendly, it's much more agile. And there's no doubt that if you look at lease lengths, in typically across the world, they have shortened. In the market that I sit in day to day, London, when I joined the industry in 2000, the average lease length was probably 15 to 20 years. The latest data suggests the average lease length in London is just short of 7 years. But 7 years in a business environment is eons. It's probably 3 planning cycles. So yes, we've got shorter leases, but we don't necessarily have a flexibility in real estate that enables alignment with strategy. So all of these issues mean that all the good intent with real estate can be compromised because of the way that real estate is misaligned. So that's the first issue. The second issue is volatility. 33%, a third of all respondents recognise this as their biggest challenge. I find this graph fascinating. What this is the Chicago Board Options Exchange view of sort of global economic volatility. It's a sort of 3-month forward-looking view. You can see on the trace the black swan events that we've all become accustomed to talking about, GFC back in 2008, the Eurozone crisis. There was a little blip around the time of the EU referendum, and then a huge spike in 2020 around the pandemic. So what? I mean, they're black swan events. We have a lot of them in recent history, but we always have them as businesses, and we always have to respond to them in the best way that we possibly can. That to me is not what's interesting to the slide. What's interesting to the slide to me is the trace post-pandemic. So it's a more elevated level of volatility, and with a more spiky trace, which shows the volatility is even more volatile than it has been historically. This is why occupiers in the main in global markets have been applying the brakes globally and are deferring decisions, because they've been waiting for calmer waters. They've been waiting for this trace to sort of level out a little bit and return to normal. The problem is that I think this elevated level of uncertainty and volatility might actually be the new normal, a phrase I hate using, but I can't think of one better. So a new normal. And the reason I say that is that the items down the right-hand side in the imagery, more war and conflict, more environmental catastrophe, and definitely a more challenging geopolitical environment, irrespective of your political hue. So those occupiers that are sitting there saying, well, we'll just wait for calm waters, I'm not sure that calmer water is coming. And as a result, one of the things that we're saying to clients increasingly is, you need to start having a bit of bravery, making decisions without perfect operating environments, without perfect information, because things are unlikely to calm. And all the time that you're sitting on the sidings waiting, the markets are turning further against you. How have occupiers to date responded to volatility? Well, they've taken a more conservative approach. They've focused on cost containment. They've tried to promote a shift towards flexibility. I mentioned flexibility in leases, definitely more optionality in leases, but also flexibility in footprint. So when people take a floor, how divisible is that floor? How can you reconfigure it? How can you load it? How can you de-densify it according to your the quantum that you want to occupy, of people that you want to occupy the space? And then there's a growing issue, which is the flexibility of buildings, particularly multi-let buildings, and the use of common area, event space, flex space within multi-let buildings, which enable the occupier to draw down on that space, but also to maximize the demise that they're leasing in conventional terms. The one thing occupiers haven't done today in this volatile world, and you can see it there in green, less than 10% have actually diversified geographically to hedge risk. Again, bear in mind, 80% of all respondents surveyed before Liberation Day. I believe we're seeing, and I know, having just returned from Hong Kong and Ho Chi Minh, those markets are seeing geographical diversification play out in the marketplace. We are seeing occupiers looking towards China plus many strategies rather than China plus one, as a direct consequence of changes in trading relationships. And I suspect that will be a future roadmap for most also, not just manufacturers, although manufacturers are obviously at the crest of the wave on that particular issue. That's the first challenge area. Second challenge area, portfolio management. Given what I just said about that trading relationship piece, and I'll deal with this pretty briefly, what are the big issues from a portfolio management standpoint? Again, bearing in mind most of our respondents are multi-market. Well, a very different first slide here. There's one issue that dominates. So 55% of all respondents said their biggest challenge is absolutely right-sizing the portfolio and achieving agility to do that. And about 1 in 5 also pointed to relocation of functions and facilities, largely as a response to obsolescence of either their space from a physical standpoint, i.e. the building's just not up to it any longer, or from a functional standpoint, i.e. the building is configured, shaped, of a size which isn't appropriate for the way it's now being used. I want to sort of dominate, again, focus on the top two issues, but really focus down on right sizing, because it is a dominant discussion in the markets at the moment. Please, again, just if you didn't hear what I said earlier, look at my headline, right sizing. It's a makeover, not a haircut. Lots of journalists love to talk about it all being about downsizing of space. This is about optimization of space. It's about ensuring your footprint is commensurate with the staff that you have today and the staff that you're likely to have maybe 2 years from today. So right sizing, very much a focus. We are in the foothills of right sizing. Okay, so about 50% of the occupiers that we surveyed recognise the criticality of right sizing and are already underway. And indeed, there are some that have done it already. You know, the poster children of right sizing. And one of the reasons the journalists often talk about downsizing are companies like HSBC, companies like Amazon, who have reduced their footprint. And it's been sort of seen as sort of the shape of things to come for other occupiers. What's often missed in that conversation is that Amazon were long on space because they were growing at 20% headcount per annum globally. So if you're growing at that pace, you have to do space to accommodate that growth. If that growth doesn't come, or you work with a slightly different work style, you don't need it, and therefore you give it back in the market. That's optimization of space, but it's positioned in the market as all occupiers losing 40% of their portfolio because Amazon have done the same. There's a much, much more nuanced position here. In fact, 1 in 5 of the occupiers that we surveyed anticipate shaping their portfolio. 1 in 5 anticipate increasing their overall global portfolio by 1 to 10% of its existing size over the next 5 years. So right sizing is not a one-way street. I can't emphasize that point enough. Incidentally, and I also have responsibility at Knight Frank for our London research, 9 out of 10 deals undertaken in the London market this year have seen the occupier increase the amount of space they're occupying in London. Positive net absorption, effectively, at an occupier level. So this notion that everybody's cutting space, we need to be very careful about it. It's much more nuanced. Relocations, just a quick word on relocations. It is very clear that occupiers do want new solutions. This is the point in the presentation where I talk about a flight to quality. That about £1 for every time I read flight to quality in industry press, I'd probably be able to retire. There is definitely a flight to quality, although the amount of quality being supplied by global markets is diminishing rapidly. 40% of all occupiers that we survey think it's definite, very likely or fairly likely they'll relocate within the next 3 years. That's commensurate with the number that we saw in 2023. The difference is that in 2023 and the subsequent period, they didn't have the confidence to do so. They probably were mistaken in thinking that there were lots of solutions which could enable them to defer their decision. And the other thing that is clearly here is this is, again, understating the reality, I think, because of the nature of trading relationships, a point I've made a number of times. Right, I'm conscious of time, so I want to get on to the bit that a lot of people would be interested in, I think, which is workplace evolution. The only thing I would say about relocation in closing is, from the position of an occupier, we're very sort of, we throw away the comment around, oh, well, companies are relocating. From a company perspective, it's high cost and high risk. If you get it wrong, you can cause enormous damage to your business. You might make a really smart real estate play and save money, but if you upset your staff and upset their commute and make it difficult for them to get to the space, or they don't like the solution, then actually that is a false economy, because the cost of losing people to the business is going to be much greater. So as a consequence, one of the things that we're seeing within our business, particularly in our consulting business, is a lot of due diligence being done to effectively model the impact of a potential relocation on staff before any decision is made. In fact, that's exactly what we did as a business in advance of our upcoming move to the City of London. So just the point there around occupiers have to think about this, and are thinking about this in a much more scientific way. Let's get on to the third challenge area, which is this whole point about how the workplace is evolving. And again, I'm going to flash up the overall response where occupiers identified their biggest challenges. The first thing you'll notice from that slide is look how more even the distribution of responses is across this challenge area. Unsurprising to me, because what we have seen from a corporate real estate perspective over the last 6 years is very little focus on future space and new markets, and lots of focus on existing space. How do you make that space more attractive? How do we ensure that we get people back to support wider corporate mandates, et cetera, et cetera? So the muscle memory that runs through corporate real estate professionals is very much at a workplace level. And the discussion around workplace evolution is arguably the most advanced part of the job. As a result, you get this sort of distribution. I'm going to, in the interest of time, just focus on the top three here. But they all hinge around the second one. So 25% still thinking their biggest challenge is aligning work style with workplace. From that derives a lot of issues around utilization and occupancy rates, but also the role of amenities and services in making the workplace more attractive, given that people have choice as to whether they use it or not. So that's what comes in the last few minutes of this presentation. But let's start with work style. I've noted a couple of times I'm pretty old and I've been around a long time, but I'm no dinosaur. And I know that there are elements of the property sector that would still suggest that if we buy our time, we'll return to an office future, which is 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and back to where we were. I don't buy it. I think the genie is out of the bottle on flexible working. As I said earlier, our relationship with the office will become more fluid and flexible, but there is more variation and change in the way that we would like staff to work. What this graph is showing you is two things going on here. The bold bars are effectively the dominant work styles, or the proportion of work styles 3 years from now. The arrows are the direction of travel from today to 3 years from now. So the future is very much hybrid, which I define as 3 days a week in the office, 2 remote, but with a slight compression from where we are today. So at the moment, 50% of our occupiers thereabouts are in a hybrid setting, and that reduces to about 46% over the course of the next 3 years. And the beneficiary is office first, which I define as 4 days a week in the office, 1 remote, which actually many organizations, and we forget this at our peril, but many organizations were in that place pre-pandemic, don't forget. The other thing is, on this office first piece, much more easy to manage from a real estate perspective. If you have buildings full for 4 days and fallow for 3, that's a better situation than perhaps the hybrid one. And also, isn't it interesting that the sort of 4-day working week has become a test pilot in more and more markets around the world and seems to produce quite good results. If you're office only 5 days a week, you're generally American, dare I say it. The office is a bastion of command and control. You're generally a bank. We know the banks came out of the traps very quickly post-pandemic and said, no ifs, no buts, 5 days a week, back to the office. There's a little bit of movement around remote first, but that tends to be the smaller organizations in our sample and those focused at the tech sector end of our response pool. The bit that's interesting to me in all of this is the other. What you don't see is when I create a survey, if you click other, you have to specify what other is. And the 7% of respondents who clicked other in this instance all said the same thing. I've never seen it before, but I thought I'd been hacked because all the words in the free text box were exactly the same. And the other is, in the future, we will be doing all of this. So I think one of the challenges that we have is we love, from a simplicity standpoint, to think about binary solutions. The relationship between office and remote. But actually, what we've done is we've simplified what is a very complex picture. And that what we're going to see more of going forward is a range of different work style settings across organizations, depending on role, task, geography, etc., culture. So the notion that we're going to have one organization working in one way, I think is fanciful. It's, and if you think from a corporate real estate perspective, delivering space to support a new work style is easy now, or it's complex now, sorry, it's going to get a hell of a lot more complex. And dare I say it, a little bit more emotive as well. So with that in mind, This, to me, is the big dilemma for corporate real estate leaders in the context of office space right now. Let's keep things simple. Let's think about those that are adopting a hybrid model. What a hybrid model effectively does is it means you have one day a week, let's say it's Wednesday, where you have 80% occupancy, which is where we were pre-pandemic on a 5-day-a-week basis. Okay, you never get to 100% occupancy. So 80% occupancy on a Wednesday, but in a hybrid model, you get a sort of a waterfall effect either side of that peak, somewhere down to maybe 20% on a Monday and 10% on a Friday at extremes. And until about 6 months ago, most organizations were just comfortable with the notion that they were planning for the peak, i.e. they could accommodate everybody on that peak day of occupancy, and they were going to just accept that real estate's always been illiquid and inefficient, and they were going to just accept that. However, remember what I said in the first slide about this balance between transformation and cost control. CFOs are starting to sharpen their pencils, and CFOs only ever visit office buildings and walk the floors on a Monday or a Friday when they see low levels of utilization. And as a consequence, we've now started to see in the playbook occupiers thinking about reducing the delta, i.e. the gap between peak and trough. Now, the challenge is how you do that. And the way that most organizations seem to be doing that at the moment is creating a model which is effectively a structured hybrid. So we'll have certain parts of our business coming in Monday to Wednesday, some Tuesday to Thursday, etc., etc. That will bring your peak down, but what it also does is takes away some of the choice that staff may have got used to. And that is the big trade-off at the moment for corporate real estate leaders. To what extent is the corporate real estate play a property play or a people play? There are more organizations that I speak to now that have given up on the planning for peak and are thinking about reducing the delta. As a consequence, not only are they changing their work style and the pattern of that work style, they're also thinking more intently now around hot desking and different workplace settings that lead to different levels of utilization. A couple of final points, if I may. One is about amenity. I mentioned flight to quality earlier. The flight to quality is actually a flight to three things. It's a flight to flexibility, it's a flight to sustainability, or sustainably credentialed buildings, certified buildings, and it's a flight to amenity. This is an interesting slide, or it is to me. It's one that gives landlords a bit of a mild coronary, because this is the shopping list, if you like, of occupiers in terms of the amenity that they would ideally like to see or supply to their staff within the workplace. Two things I would take away from this. One, if you're going to appeal to staff, appeal to the stomach. Food and beverage, 75% of all respondents think if you provide food and beverage offer that's deep, broad, plentiful, not necessarily free. You can see the free bit on the other side of the chart. Then you go a long way to creating a good working environment. But it is much more complex than that. What I would suggest is that all of these amenities are actually about well-being. And I think there are three phases of well-being. There's gym facilities and cycle storage. That's pretty de rigueur now. Even in Bangalore, I see buildings with that. If you're cycling in Bangalore, you definitely need a shower at the end of it, so you're going to need end of trip facilities. But it's standard. You don't see that generally as a differentiator in office buildings now. It's well supplied. The second area of well-being is about mental well-being, psychological well-being. The Australians, I hate to say this in a National year, but the Australians were miles ahead of us elsewhere in the world on this by providing sanctuary space, by thinking intently about building an office design that gives access to natural light, biophilia, all of that stuff to support mental well-being. That's risen up the agenda from the 2023 survey. I think there's a third area of well-being that I would suggest we keep a close eye on, and it's the second issue, educational facilities. And this is the point in the presentation, although I am running out of time, but it's the point in the presentation where I use the dreaded AI phrase, because one of the things that's definitely happening is AI is going to come into the world of work. In my own view, it's not going to displace the majority of office workers. It's going to support and supplement their work and make them more productive, but it's going to create more capacity for those people. And one of the big corporate agendas is what do we do with that capacity? In order to fill that capacity, they're going to need to up and reskill people. And in so doing, we're starting the emergence of educational facilities in office space, bleacher spaces, events programs, corporate universities, learning environments that are also classrooms. I would say they are quite significant trends, as indeed is the emergence of educational institutions as occupiers of office space in core CBD markets. So one to watch out for. I think it's coming. If you look at some of the professional service firms where learning is key to the success in the profession and attaining professional qualifications, education is a key driver and a key requirement of the office. One other thing on amenity, I do worry because I think we have got ourselves into a bit of an arms race on amenity, not led by the occupier, but led by the developer. So you see a lot of developers put in some really far out amenity into their building because it differentiates their building. That's good practice if you're trying to market a building, but what it does is it takes the building further and further away from the true needs of the customer. How many buildings actually think about simple things like technology? It's well known that if your technology experience is poor, your workplace experience is poor. But we don't see any impetus from either landlord or occupier working in partnership to address the technology infrastructure of a building. We'd much rather think about some far out there type amenity. So I think there is a sense of going back to doing the basics brilliantly. That will actually be really important for developers as well, for reasons I can't really go on to in the interest of time. I've got one more slide, Mark, if I may, and I know I've run a little bit long, but hopefully this is germane to people's interests and thoughts. The other thing that I worry about is how we're thinking about the office of the future. Too many presentations that I have been to over the course of the last 6 years, you walk away from it with the sort of ringing in your ears, the statement, the office of the future is about collaboration. And what that often is code for is the office of the future is about open plan. But what happens when you look at an open plan floor? You see 4 people sitting in a row on an open plan floor. 3 of them have got noise cancelling headphones in, and 2 of them are on the same Teams call. There's no innovation going on. There's no collaboration going on. It's become a fallacy. And I think one of the things we need to think very carefully about in terms of workplace design is balancing what I call we space with me space. There is no doubt a big role of the office going forward is to create a multiplicity of workplace settings that enable different types of work, rather than just creating a vanilla, generic, open plan space where everybody chews the cud and collaborates. That is not the office of the future in my book. So in summary, I think these are the points I've made as we've gone through. Corporate real estate, it's got a bit of a defining moment. We've seen a lot of deferral of decisions. I think the time for action is now. Don't forget about these corporate transformation pressures. They do have real estate implications, and no portfolio is safe from disruption at all. This will drive demand. The workplace is being reimagined, a phrase you hear a lot, but I think it's being reimagined less around presence and more around performance. But we also need to think about amenity, true practical amenity, and a blend between me and we space. And the final thing is a sort of a shout out to our respondents, our corporate real estate leaders. There's no doubt they recognise the challenges. They're very keen to rise to them, but there is a slight issue around their positioning within the corporate machine. They typically are somewhat sidelined and underpowered. Mark, apologies, I've gone a little bit long. I think that's just a function of my passion for this topic, but I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Great. We will. I'm going to take the time, so if people need to leave, feel free to do so. I put Lee's email address in the chat. Lee, thank you for your clarity and your candor. It's just superb insights. Thank you for that.
Pleasure.
We're going to be using a lot of this data internally as well, I'm pretty sure. So I just want to clarify because there seems to be a little bit of confusion. The number that you quote are people managing large portfolios. Is that right? Those respondents are people managing. So, because Carl asks the point, how many of the respondents were in the Middle East. It might not be the respondent was based there, but they manage portfolio in the Middle East. Is that, am I right?
That's correct. So, yeah, it's very difficult to make this geographically specific because 80% of the people that responded are operating across border. So we'll have some people that have got an EMEA brief that may or may not, or a European brief that doesn't include the Middle East. We'll have some that are focused on APAC. We'll have some that are truly global. So it's very difficult to distinguish this at a country level. God knows I've tried over the years. It is more of a regional and a global picture. And I'll just reiterate the point I made. These are all proper occupiers, right, that are managing lots and lots of space, 650 million square foot of space across the world. Yeah, this is not the world according to Lee. This is not the world according to Knight Frank. This is the world according to global customers, people that are occupying space.
Thank you. So when you're in Dubai, do pop and see Carl. He'll take you for a beer.
Sounds great. I'm there shortly, so I will.
Okay, good. A couple of questions have related to co-working and serviced offices.
Yeah.
Using their serviced offices and also using co-working. Any points you want to make and views around that?
Yeah, a couple of points. So the first is interesting that, when we started the Your Space journey in 2018, co-working was very much of the moment. It was the new kid on the block. As I said at the time, we would see a multiplicity of operators, and over time they would consolidate because they'd be challenged, and the model would change. And there's no doubt the co-working model has changed. It's much less about operators leasing space. It's much more about landlords creating their own product with their own infrastructure and their own people, and it becoming a supplement to more conventional leases. That was the point I was making about building flexibility. I think the one thing that we're seeing quite clearly at the moment around the sort of whole co-working service space is a lot of appetite for flexible solutions. But to be candid, whenever we've done our survey, there's this sort of school of thought somewhere in the industry that, the future is completely flexible. I don't buy that. What we hear from mainstream occupiers is consistently they want around about 20% of their global footprint in co-working and about 80% on more conventional lease terms. The one thing that might change that a little is that I think the real sort of powerhouse of this part of the market presently is the emergence of enterprise managed solutions. So effectively turnkey solutions, which reduce the CapEx requirement of an occupier from a fit out standpoint. It's ready fitted out. It's got all your great furniture in it, Mark, and away you go. And we're seeing a lot of appetite, particularly as people scale into new markets, that they want that turnkey solution. So they're not spending their time having to procure space. They're ready to hit the ground and start shaping their business.
Great. If you want to stop sharing now, people can see your lovely face in bigger screen.
Well, I don't know if they want to do that, but I'll give it a go.
Someone has asked for clarity around the term that you use, Liberation Day.
Yes. I'm not sure if I've stopped sharing. Have I?
You haven't, no.
There we go. Liberation Day was, the early April when Mr. Trump came out with his board and talked about all the change in tariffs and the variability of tariffs as they would affect the relationship between the US and other markets around the world. Effectively, although, there's a lot of devil in the detail and there's a lot of time that will pass before that we get to a solid position, what that was about was upending the orthodoxy of the global economy that we've become accustomed to over the last 20 years. And irrespective of your position on that politically, in reality, what it means is that we will have different trading relationships around the world, and occupiers will need to make sure they're the right side of those trading relationships as they emerge. I mentioned tariffs are not new, incidentally. They're not only adopted by the Trump administration. Biden was a believer in tariffs too. What they are effectively doing is they are upending trading relationships, and ensuring that occupiers need to think about where they put their dots on the map. The great outcome of the first round of tariffs was manufacturers needed a China plus one strategy because China was heavily impacted. That's now become a China plus many because of the other markets in and around that were dominating the trade flows as a consequence of that decision, and now all now have slightly different tariff positions. So it's just a much more complex picture. And when you get complexity, you tend to see more hedging. So that's liberation there, changing the way the world works.
Yeah, and with the complexity comes that uncertainty, which our market hates, of course.
Correct.
That is a challenge.
Yeah.
A question from Brian: do you think we'll see stronger emphasis on ESG with the rollout of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU for both EU and non-EU companies, that are trading in the EU, basically? Is that going to impact ESG?
It's nice to see that Brian's on the call. We've exchanged notes historically on some of this. Yes, I think what it's doing, you just mentioned the word complexity market, it just means there's another layer of reporting and another, unfortunately, we don't have a global structure to reporting. What we're seeing around the ESG piece is that, anybody that's listed needs to really get on with the ESG piece and illustrate how they're reaching targets. Anyone that's not can probably downplay it a little bit. And there is undoubtedly a little bit of a differential between what's going on in the US and the rest of the world. So US corporates perhaps are a little bit less attuned to this, but those directives just require companies to play ball and be compliant. The challenge is, I think, how many different mechanisms are people going to need to be compliant with? I'm by no means an expert in ESG, Mark, by the way. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. One final question I'm going to give you is kind of the changes you've seen in lease lengths over the years. Where are we at now, and do you think that's going to change even more?
Well, it's interesting. I think we're a bit of an inflection point. I'll use London as an example because it's the market that I touch most regularly in terms of product. I mentioned that lease lengths have shortened from sort of 15, 20 years when I first started to somewhere short of MSCI. Will tell you the average London lease length is now just short of 7 years. But we're in a market now, even in London, where there is an acute shortage of quality supply. So prime grade A or prime new vacancy is less than 1%. Typically, when you get to those levels of vacancy, developers press the button and build. And they haven't done that. So we're going to have a diminished pipeline for longer. And as a result, what we're going to see, I think, at the top end of the market is occupiers going long on leases in order to secure those solutions. Because obviously, in a shortened supply environment, landlords can determine longer income flows. Having said all of that, they may go longer in terms of the overall lease, but they want to build more optionality into the leases, whether that's breaks or whether that's for buildings that are emerging out of the ground, not practically complete, more options on upsizing the amount of space they take ahead of occupation. We've seen a lot of that in the big office towers in the City of London, for example. So inflection point, I think, it's a complete reversal of where I was when I started, because you were getting shorter lease lengths in the office sector and longer lease lengths in industrial, because the amount of capex that had to go into an industrial shed from a manufacturer meant a 5-year lease didn't make any sense because you had to rip out all the kit that you'd spent millions on. So we're coming to some sort of world of balance, I think, on lease lengths.
Lee, thank you for an outstanding session. Thank you for great input and great insights. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.